Hello, this is Boniface from the blog Unam Sanctam Catholicam, and the title of this reflection is The Shortcomings of Catholic Eschatology. Modern Catholic eschatology is pitiful. I'm sorry, it really is. I've studied it my whole adult life, and I've yet to find a really good book on Catholic eschatology, and I have at least a dozen in my library, and they all have some strong points, but they're all very weak in many areas. And besides those dozen I've had, I've looked at many others that I don't own. So what I'd like to do in this talk is go over some problems with Catholic eschatology today. And I'm certainly not holding up Protestant eschatology as the model. Protestant eschatology obviously has serious problems. For one thing, Protestant eschatology insists on too much precision in interpretation due to an exegetical style that's overly literal, which I think is due to their unfamiliarity with the allegorical exegetical method used by the fathers and Catholic theologians. So in Protestant eschatology, there tends to be an overly literal focus on the symbols that we see in the Apocalypse, for example. And secondly, Protestant eschatology I find annoyingly to be too bound up with current world events. So Protestant commentaries on Revelation end up being more about current world affairs and foreign policy than eschatology. They turn the Apocalypse into a book that's merely historical when it should be meta-historical. So you see a lot of these Protestant commentaries that try to relate the Apocalypse to current world events, I guess there's always a focus on the imminence of the fulfillment right now in the modern world. So it kind of makes the book historical when it should be meta-historical. Those are the big faults I see in Protestant eschatology. Now the problems with modern Catholic eschatology are a little bit different. For one thing, I've noticed that modern Catholic eschatology seems to be too caught up in preterist interpretive schemes. Now, preterism is one of the methods of approaching the Apocalypse, and preterism sees that most of these prophecies and symbols are fulfilled in the past in things like the destruction of Jerusalem or the resurrection of Christ. And it seems that a lot of the stuff that's out there today is too caught up in preterist interpretive schemes. And I guess it's the result of wanting to counter the overly literal trends in Protestantism. In Protestantism, there's kind of a hyper-futurist literal interpretation, and I think many Catholics want to counter that with a preterist interpretive scheme. And I can see where they're coming from. But the effect is that we get explanations of all the symbolism in eschatology, but since they're preterist explanations, they don't really tell us much about what to expect in the future. Eschatology is about the last things, and these are all things that are in the future for us and collectively. And when you have an interpretive scheme that looks only to the past, it really leaves us wondering still about the future. It leaves us in the dark. Secondly, I've noticed that there's too much reliance on private revelations, especially from obscure saints and blesseds. And often in Catholic eschatology, this reliance on obscure private revelation is done for the purpose of establishing the chronologies proposed by some private revelations like Garabandal or Bayside. And so these adherents get so caught up in these chronologies proposed by these private revelations that they will dig into the visions of very obscure blesseds and venerables to try to bolster their opinion, but really it's just speculative. Third shortcoming I see in Catholic eschatology is just that it's too cautious, it's too vague, too hesitant to perhaps suggest that we might be on the verge of any period of eschatological fulfillment. It seems like it's too worried about alarming people. I guess an example, one time I was going to give a Bible study at a parish on the Gospel of Matthew on our Lord's Olivet Discourse. The priest asked me to cancel the Bible study because he thought that the subject matter was too alarming, and he did not want to alarm people. He said that in this day and age, people are already too alarmed about what's going on in the world, and they don't need to be further upset. So the study on the Olivet Discourse was replaced by a rather benign study on the Book of Ruth. But at any rate, I see this in many Catholic books, that they really want to shy people away from looking for any eschatological fulfillment in the near future, almost pushing it down the road and saying, well, this will be fulfilled at the end of time, but don't think that could be anywhere close. So I think there's an overly cautious kind of vagueness to a lot of these approaches that are too worried about being alarmist. If we look back at church history, we see a very different approach to eschatology. The early church was in a constant state of eschatological expectation. Many Christians, whether or not you can debate that this was the official position of the church, but many Christians certainly in the first few centuries expected an imminent end of the world, or they believed they were already living in the time of Antichrist, the Roman persecutions. So there was a constant state of eschatological expectation. We could say they were a bit alarmist. They were always on the lookout for the Antichrist and the end of the world. And moving into the early medieval period, we know that many Christians, St. Augustine references in City of God, many Christians identified the fall of Rome with the end of the world, and St. Augustine masterfully counters that concept in the City of God. But nonetheless, we see the idea is widespread, that Christians in the early 5th century are still living in that sort of state of eschatological expectation of an imminent end of the world, or at least a transfiguration of the current world order. And this did not stop going into the medieval period. In the medieval period, there's constant eschatological speculation. It's well known that there was a good deal of this leading up to the year 1000. In the following century, in the 1100s, Joachim of Fiore was well known for eschatological speculation that the end of the world and the coming of a new age would arrive in the 13th century, and his works were read all over Europe. There was lots of speculation about the Antichrist. Henry IV, Frederick Barbarossa, and Frederick II were all called the Antichrist during their day. And eschatological speculation gets especially rife in the great Catholic 13th century, the Age of Aquinas. This is when it's actually at its height, and this is fueled in part by the feud between the spiritual and conventual Franciscans. The spiritual Franciscans see the Pope as Antichrist, and that they're living in the last days. In fact, the Franciscans and Dominicans in their own day, they said that they were the two witnesses of Revelation. So there was a lot of this going on. In the 15th century, St. Vincent Ferrer was referred to as the angel of the apocalypse by the Pope in his canonization. In the period of the Protestant revolt and the Renaissance, there was an explosive interest in prophecy and eschatology, a lot of speculation, and it crossed denominational lines. I mean, Catholics, but Protestants as well, were intensely interested in prophecy and in its imminent fulfillment. Many took the outbreak of the Protestant revolt as a sign of the coming end of the age. And even pious Catholics like Christopher Columbus, he was motivated in his exploration of the Western Sea by biblical prophecy. And after he discovered the New World, he wrote a commentary on how his discoveries of the New World fit in with biblical prophecy. Even going forward from there into the Tridentine period up to pre-Vatican II, there's more statements from the popes on eschatology. There's the vision of Leo XIII with Michael, the archangel, and the devil that we're all familiar with. There was the Fatima apparitions, of course, that were very eschatological. Right up until, and this was the case right up until Vatican II. And of course, going up to Vatican II, communism is seen as the power of the Antichrist, and many are fearing that there's an imminent end of the world coming with the advent of communism. What's the point in all this? The point is that traditionally, Catholic eschatology has stressed imminence, an imminent end of the world, an imminent, immediate coming of Antichrist. It's always had a bit of a recklessness to it. We could even call it alarmist. Catholics throughout the ages have always been on the lookout for the Antichrist, on the lookout for the signs prophesied by our Lord, and always had the at least openness to the idea that they could be the last generation. So they definitely were alarmist by today's standards. The focus in church tradition was always on what was about to happen. We're always on the verge of eschatological fulfillment, and the question was always, what can we expect to happen next? So if you're looking at interpretive schemes, the Catholic tradition here has always been futurist, looking towards the future and wondering what can we expect, what sort of eschatological signs are about to break forth on this earth. Now, this is totally different from the current literature on the topic. As I mentioned, the current literature tends to be too vague, too cautious, too wrapped up in preterist explanations that dwell on interpreting the symbols historically, too focused on invoking private revelations to establish assumed chronologies. And different books have strengths, but none of them are completely satisfactory. So my personal opinion here, where Catholic eschatology needs to be, is first of all, we need to not be afraid to be a little alarmist, to recapture some of that tradition. After all, the coming of Antichrist will happen someday, and when it's happening, will Catholic apologists still be saying, calm down, don't get alarmed? We don't want to provoke people to undue panic, but at the other hand, we need to know that these events will happen someday, and that we do need to watch out for them, and be prepared, as our Lord said. Number two, we need to not be afraid to offer specific futurist interpretations of the symbols in prophecy. This is what Catholic theologians and saints throughout the ages have done. So we don't have to be afraid to say that maybe the mark of the beast is a computer chip. In the 14th century, they were speculating it was something else, and in the patristic age, something else as well. So I'm not saying it is a computer chip, but I don't think we need to be afraid to speculate, to offer specific, concrete interpretations of what these symbols might mean. Number three, I think we should treat this as something that Catholics should be intensely interested in. Catholics throughout the ages were intensely interested in eschatology. We should be too, and we should encourage the study of eschatology. So, I guess I have a lot more to say, but I'm running up against time here. So in the spirit of being alarmist, I'm going to get moving, go hoard ammunition, food, and convert my savings into silver to prepare for a Bilderberger orchestrated New World Order takeover. How's that for alarmist? Anyhow, till next time, this is Boniface from Unum Sanctam Catholicam. God bless you. Bye-bye.